Alright, so welcome back to another video in the Coding for People series. Once again, this is a series focused towards brand new programmers who don't really have any knowledge of computers or computer programming yet. So today we're going to talk about common knowledge, so programming that you can almost already do, but you just don't know the syntax for it. I'll talk about a little topic, and then we're going to do an example using Python. So first we're going to talk about variables. I'm sure in math you've seen something like this, x equals 5. So of course that means that x then equals 5. So whenever it's seen, we know x can be replaced with 5 and we can get the proper value. So for example, x times 2 or 2x would equal 10. So in programming, we can have variables of almost any name depending on the limits of the language. In other words, maybe it can't start with a number or it can't start with an uppercase letter, but that's besides the point. So let's jump to the Python interpreter and we'll show you an example. Okay, so here we are in a Python interpreter. I'm not going to go too much into what all of this means, but you can see I can basically type things in and press enter and they'll run. So let's declare a couple of variables and I'll show you how those work. So let's just do x equals 5 for right now. So you can see that enters, there's no errors. And if I type in x now, you can see it returns 5. And then if I type in x times 2, it says 10. X times 4, it says 20. X minus 10, it'll give me -5. So pretty straightforward how that works. Now let's get into some different data types so we can do more variables than just whole numbers. Okay, so a data type is what describes the type of data that something holds or returns. So a data type can be something like an integer, a float, a double, a boolean, a char, string. Those are just some examples. If you don't know what that means, that's fine. We're going to go over it right now. Here we have integers. So an integer is a whole number, and it's referred to as an int usually in programming. So when we did that other example right here, we were using integers. So x is an int value. If I do type x, and you don't need to really know what this means, but it just type means give me the type of this value. And you'll see it'll say int, okay? So let's just jump back. And let's give some examples of things that aren't integers. So here we have like 1.5, 1/4, -89.3. Anything that has a decimal or is a fraction or isn't even a number to begin with, those are not integers. So then we're going to talk about floats and doubles. In Python, these are, I don't want to say the same thing, but we really only have one of them. In other programming languages, you will see a difference usually, but we're going to ignore that for right now. So a float and a double is any number that has a decimal point in it. So the difference between doubles and floats are that doubles are actually twice as precise, but that's besides the point. We'll go over that another time. But here's some examples of floats. And then down here, I have some examples of integers, but this thing is in the way. All right, there you go, 1, 6, and 4. So let's give some examples of these. So we're back to Python. Let me just clear the screen. And then we'll use a different variable. We'll do y. So if I set y equal to 1.5, you can see it just says 1.5, right? If I do y times 2, it'll say 3. Notice the 3.0, that's because it's a float and it will always have a decimal unless you have it round. It doesn't get a whole lot more complicated than that. If I do type y, it'll say class float. So just like how x said int, y says float. So boolean might be a new word to you. This might not be something that you really learned in a math class, but a boolean is a value that's either true or false. This can also be referred to as a 0 for false or a 1 for true. So here are some examples: true, false, 1, 0. Those are all booleans. So let's jump into an example. Now, I just want to make a note before we continue. True and false are capitalized in Python, but in almost every other language they are lowercase. That's just something weird with Python, so you really won't see that too much. But let's do a b, and that will be our variable here, and let's set it equal to true. And you'll see if I do b, it says true. I can also set it to false, and it says false. There are a lot of operators on booleans. There's a branch of abstract mathematics called Boolean algebra, which you do use quite a bit in programming, but that will get its own video. I know that has a complicated name, but it's actually very easy. Alright, so our next data type is the char data type. So char, you might imagine, stands for character, and it's any letter, number, emote, or symbol, usually of an ASCII value. And it's designated by single quotes in most languages. If you don't know what ASCII means, it's basically a number that's associated with a character. I'm just gonna pull up a picture of an ASCII table just in the bottom right so you can get a look at what that is. So it's nothing too complicated, but let's give some examples. So these are all characters, 5, A, and an ampersand. So let's do an example in Python. So another weird thing with Python is it doesn't actually have characters, it just has strings, but we'll get into that in the next slide. So if I do C, and I set it equal to G, for example, I can do C, it'll say G. There's really not a whole lot more to that. However, the weirdness with Python is if I do type C, it'll say str for string, but more on that later. Alright, now we're going to talk about strings. So a string is, and unfortunately I'm going to use the same word to describe it, a string or array of any number of characters. So this is also usually designated with double quotes. So if you don't know what an array is, it's basically a list of a bunch of different elements, and that creates one thing. So here are some strings. We have hello world, exclamation point, 287, and yes, you might think that's an integer, but it has the double quotes, so it's actually a string. And then 9.5432, again, that is also a string because it has the double quotes. So let's do an example of this. Let's do a variable s for string, and we'll set that equal to hello world. And if I just put in s, it'll say hello world. There's also something called concatenation, which I'm just going to go over very briefly, which is basically adding on another string. So if I want to add an exclamation point, I can just do s, so this variable, plus, and then an exclamation point. You'll see it'll now say hello world, exclamation point. And if I do type s, it will say string. So now we're going to talk about one of the more difficult data types, and this is the array data type. So I mentioned it very briefly in the last slide, but this is not technically a data type. Rather, it's a list of any data types. So they do vary greatly between languages, and we're going to talk about Python lists. So these are some arrays, 5, 10, -7, so that's an int array, 5.4, 3.45, 1.2, that is a float or double array, and h, comma, I, that is a character array. And we'll do another video just on arrays in the future because they're a much more complicated topic. I will mention shortly, in most languages, arrays can only have data types of one type, but that does vary between languages. In Python, it is possible. So if we do L for list, we can define it just like this. We'll do 1, 3, 4, 5, something like that. I should have gone in order. Let's redefine that. Now, if I just type in L, you'll see this will kind of print out. But let's talk about very briefly accessing each member of this array. So it's with open bracket, close bracket, and then inside you put the index. Index means the location of it. So, and don't get too confused by this if you're brand new to programming, but arrays start at 0. There are some languages where they don't, but it's very common that they do. So that means this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. If I put in 0, I'll get 1. If I put in 1, I'll get 2, 3, I'll get 4. So let's talk a little bit more about variables before we conclude. So in a lot of languages, a variable has to be defined by a type. So it has to have a type beforehand. In Python, that is not the case. As you've seen me type in A equals 5, B equals 4.5, something like that, that's the whole line of code, right? That's what defines the variable. But let's do a quick C example in which you have to actually say the data type beforehand. So it's almost the same where you say A equals 5, but you have to say int beforehand. You only do this once, by the way. So you say int A equals 5, and then if you want to use A in the future, you can just use A. If you want to redefine it as 4, you don't have to say int again, but we'll go over that more in the future. and then these cannot be reassigned to a different type. So now let's talk about some basic arithmetics and comparisons in math. Again, these are things you already know, so no need to stress, but 6 plus 2 equals 8, you can read this. It's very straightforward. The only thing that you might not know is this operation right here. So this percent sign is the modulus operator. So this means 10 mod 3 equals 1. So modulus is modulus division, and that means divide this number by this number, but return the remainder. So instead of returning, this goes into 10, 3.3 repeating times, you'll return the remainder, which is of course 1. And now comparisons, you can read through these simply. It's stuff you're definitely used to. So they are exactly the same in coding. The only difference, however, is the syntax. So everything on this side does not change at all. Everything here, it changes a little bit. So if we look at something like greater than or equal to, since we don't really have this key on a keyboard, instead we do greater than equal to. And then equals, as you might have noticed, we actually used equals to define a variable. So we actually need a different operator in order to check if something's equal. So instead we just use 2 equal signs. You can see that not equal to has the slash through it, and over here instead we do an exclamation point and an equal sign. That is for the reason that we don't have that key on a keyboard. So let's do some very quick examples with this. I just want to show if I do 5 equals 5, it will return a boolean, right? So either true or false. That's logical though. So if 5 equals 5, return true, and it returns true. But if I say equals 4, that is wrong, that's false. So it'll say false. 5 less than 4, false. It's pretty straightforward, that's all logical. So in conclusion, we went over the basics of variables, data types, comparisons, and math and programming. The next video, we're going to talk about what's actually the most difficult part in coding, and that's going to be how to think like a computer. So the hardest part in coding is not memorizing the syntax, learning the syntax. It's how you think like a computer, how you think like a programmer. But we're going to go into more detail with everything we talked about today in future videos. And of course, let's leave off with a little programming meme. So right here, this is actually a JavaScript console. So what this person did was they made a character array and they put emotes inside of it. So we have an egg and then a chicken, and it says sort these. So of course, the famous what came first, the chicken or the egg, and it outputted chicken, comma, egg. So now we know that the chicken comes first. So I hope you enjoyed. As always, let me know if you have any questions, leave any comments down below, and stay tuned for next time. Thanks for watching, and be safe.